Coming up on this episode, the NBA trade deadline is just a few days away, so I'm going to go through 5 hypothetical deals that the Warriors should consider as they remain 12th in the Western Conference with a 21-25 record. Yes, welcome back to the Golden State with Mates podcast. Just a few hours away here from the Warriors taking on the Brooklyn Nets in another huge matchup, another needed win for Golden State after a back-to-back that promised so much, yet delivered a 1-1 result against the Memphis Grizzlies and the Atlanta Hawks. A 121-101 impressive win against the Grizzlies, and then Steph Curry, an historic night for him against Atlanta, becoming just the second player alongside Kobe Bryant, the late, great Kobe Bryant, to record 60-plus points at the age of 35 or older. An unbelievable performance, and yet his team walks away with another overtime loss there, 19th in the last 23 overtime games. Try and wrap your head around that. 60 points from Steph, the loss, 141-134. As I said in the intro there, 21-25 on the season. Still pushing uphill here to try and get back in the play-in tournament first and foremost, and then a playoff spot. I actually had an episode, I started recording an episode about this time yesterday, kind of looking back on those two matchups, that back-to-back against the Grizzlies and Hawks, and then it completely crashed halfway through the episode. So that was a bit frustrating. Hopefully that doesn't happen this time around, but you know what happened. Steph, absolutely crazy, some ridiculous shot making in the fourth quarter. He had 22 points in the fourth. Hit that floater with 13 seconds to go to put the Warriors up 2. They couldn't get a stop with the DeJounte Murray pull-up, game-tying jumper to send the game to overtime. Although Steph did have that kind of floating bank shot going left at the buzzer in regulation, which, based on the way he was playing in that fourth quarter, I'm surprised he missed. But it's hard to put the blame on Steph when he was absolutely incredible in that game. And unfortunately, his performance was wasted by, let's say, Klay Thompson. 4 of 19 shooting, 2 of 13 from three-point range, 4 of 22, I think, from three-point range across the back-to-back against the Grizzlies and Hawks. Bad. In fact, bad's a light way to put it. Absolutely, an absolute horror show is what I have described it in some of my writing. Absolutely awful. And it goes to show here that, I think that the illness that Klay might have dealt with last week, he obviously missed that Philly game. To me, it showed that he wasn't quite over that. A lot of his jump shots were left short. I did want to give him some leeway. I had a mate message me on the Saturday, it was Australian time when we played the Grizzlies, and he was kind of complaining about Klay, and I wanted to give him some leeway because of the illness, and I thought he's not quite over it. He doesn't close the game, which I thought was notable. Brandon Pajemski closed over him, obviously, alongside Steph, Wiggs, JK, and Draymond. And then the same would happen the following night against the Hawks had Wiggins not got injured at the end of the first half there. Of course, he missed the entire second half and overtime, which proved critical given Trae Young was able to get off the leash a little bit in that second half. Really started to heat up, as did Murray towards the end of regulation and overtime as well, where Atlanta scored the first 11 points and it was all over. I mean, what else do we expect in overtime games now? It's just a formality, basically. When Golden State go to overtime games, you just know they're going to lose, particularly when it comes after having a really strong chance of winning in regulation. And obviously that was the case with just needing one stop at the end or Steph making that floater. I mean, it was a formality once it went to overtime. So the real question here is, does it reinforce the need for the Warriors to make a move? I think that game against Atlanta was a reflection of a lot of the issues that they've faced this season offensively. Of course, the reliance or the over-reliance on Steph and not having the secondary support for him. Obviously, Klay was awful, as I said. JK, one of his worst games in the last couple of weeks, which I actually thought it was quite encouraging, the fact he still had 16 points on 50% shooting in that game. But I think the length of Jalen Johnson, bothered him a little bit. And, of course, a lot of his drives, there seemed to be, multiple Hawks defenders trying to dig down on him and get strips. And I think that's going to have to be something that he tries to work through as we go forward here. But I was slightly encouraged by the fact he had 16 points in what was a pretty bad game from him, and then he fouled out, which didn't help, obviously, late in regulation with a couple of ticky-tack fouls against Trey. And then defensively, overall, the lack of size, I think, we've been very positive on the whole Wiggins, Kuminga, Green, front court experience here since Draymond's return. But once you take Wiggs out and you put Pods there and you're still running with Draymond at the 5, it's really, really small. And, the Warriors have long had those issues without a genuine center that Steve seems to trust, because in that overtime period, I'm sorry, Lester Quinonia's second leading scorer in the game was really good, but TJD should have been out there. TJD should have been out there to give more size, to give more defensive presence against the Hawks, and instead Steve goes to a 4-guard lineup and Draymond at the 5. It's just not going to work. It just flat out simply is not going to work. Now, he's going to argue Clay's not a guard anymore. He's a forward. Well, he's the starting shooting guard, isn't he? In this lineup that started the last few games, he's still a guard to me. And so 4 guards and Draymond, that's a recipe, for disaster, really. So does it reinforce the need for a move here? I wouldn't overreact on the whole Steph 60, the whole over-reliance on Steph, because you've seen the jump that JK's made. Wiggs has started to be a little bit better. Clay is just as bad as he was at times early in the season. He's not going to have games as bad as he was against the Hawks. He's just not. 4 of 19 shooting. He's going to be much better than that going forward. So I don't think we should overreact to the offensive side of things with that. And so you look at the last 15 games, the Warriors, I think, still remain second in offensive rating over that period. So to me, what they need to do before the deadline doesn't necessarily go with, needing an offensive option like we often thought, mentioning guys like Siakam and, I don't know, Kuzma or someone like that. But it really, I think, defensively, they need an option at center that Steve's going to trust in big moments. And he doesn't trust Looney anymore, and probably rightly so with how he's played this season. And he doesn't yet trust TJD. So you need to find someone else there who is not necessarily, going to upset the apple cart of the starting lineup, which I still think is relatively positive. And I still think, Wiggins doesn't get injured in the first half. I still think they probably win that game, and the starting lineup continues to look pretty good. But they need another option in case of emergency. Break glass, a guy that is going to be a trustworthy shot blocking, sizable option at center, where you don't have to put the pressure on Draymond every time to necessarily close games. So I'm going to go through 5 hypothetical deals here for the Warriors ahead of the deadline. Now, it sounds, I think Sham said only a couple of hours ago, it sounds like there's nothing really that's moving the needle for the Warriors to necessarily make a move right now. These ones would for me anyway, and I hope they're somewhat realistic. You can let me know in the comments. If anything, I try and give up too much, because I know how much rival fans get annoyed when the person proposing these hypothetical trades is quite clearly biased towards their own team. So I'm going to try and stay as realistic as possible. So in no particular order, we'll start with, so there's a report over the weekend, Action Network's Matt Moore speaking about the Orlando Magic, and they're interested in acquiring a veteran point guard. Now, I think Jake Fisher at Yahoo Sports might have come out and said that's not necessarily the case. But regardless, Chris Paul was mentioned along with Kyle Lowry as a potential option for Orlando before the deadline. In that same report, Moore also mentioned that the Magic hold interest in Moses Moody. Just a side point, Moody will return against Brooklyn. He's been out, I think, 9 games with a calf strain. Obviously had back-to-back 21-point games before he went out, so good to have Moses back. And it's going to be vitally important in the Warrior rotation, given we've seen significant minutes for two-way contracted guy in Lester Quinonius and even Guy Santos as well in the last couple of games. But Moody is back. However, as I said, Orlando reportedly have interest in him. The Warriors, on the other hand, reportedly have interest in Jonathan Isaac. So I'm trying to formulate a deal here with Chris Paul and Moses Moody heading to Orlando, and Jonathan Isaac being the first piece that comes back from a Warrior standpoint. Isaac's a really interesting player because he's clearly one of the best defenders in the league when he's up, going and healthy. He's got the nickname Minister of Defense for a reason. Going back to I think it was the start of the 1920 season, I think he averaged 1.6 steals and 2.3 blocks per game. Just an absolutely unreal defender. And you see what OG Anunoby has done for the Knicks. He's out injured at the moment, but before that, the Knicks 14-2 or something in the first 16 games with Anunoby in the lineup. You see what he's been able to do for the Knicks with his defensive capacity. And Isaac could be similar. However, he just cannot stay on the floor. He's played 77 games since the start of the 1920 season. That's 5 years. Played 77 games in 5 years, not even a full season. So he's back. He's playing at the moment. I think he played about 21 minutes yesterday for the Magic. Probably not the player that he once was, or the player that the Magic hoped they would get out of him when they drafted him 6th overall back in the day. But still, certainly a difference-making defender. 6'10", play at the 4. You'd expect that if the Warriors were to get him, he'd play quite a lot at the 4 or the 5 next to Draymond as well. Just fortify the defensive capability. Can shoot the ball okay from three-point range, but I think he's under 30% so far this season, which isn't great. He's had years closer to nearly 40%, but on his career, okay three-point shooter, not a great three-point shooter. But obviously he's going to bring the defensive size, not a center as such, but he is 6'10", long wingspan, 7'1" wingspan, I think. And just a great defensive player when he's up and running. So that's the first piece. And then obviously with Chris Paul's contract, you'd have to get someone else. This is where it gets interesting. I think the Magic would probably, if they were to do it, they would want to give up Markelle Fultz. That would alleviate some issues for the Warriors. The whole Chris Paul thing, the weekends back-to-back was really the first time where Brandon Podziemski had played as the backup point guard for the Warriors, basically in all his minutes this season. Otherwise, he's played with one of Steph, CP3, or Corey Joseph. Kojo out of the rotation, Lester Quinones in, gives more of the ball handling and playmaking responsibilities to Pods. So it's really interesting, like, if they do wish to move Chris Paul, what do the Warriors do with their backup point guard situation? Are they happy for Pods to be the backup point guard, kind of sixth man straight away for the rest of the season? Like, what does that look like if the Warriors actually make the playoffs? Are they still going to be comfortable then with Pods as the backup point guard? Or what is it? I guess if you bring in Fultz in that situation, you have another option there as your backup point guard. And Markelle Fultz, obviously former first overall pick of the Sixers, career hasn't quite panned out, obviously, as he would have liked. However, he still made himself into a nice, rotation player who could come in and be capable of playing 15, 20, 25 minutes a game. Had a really good year last year. I think he averaged nearly 15 points per game, 5.7 assists, 3.9 rebounds, 1.5 steals per game as well. Shot over 50% from the floor. Obviously not a great shooter, but he's really dynamic and athletic, can get to the rim. So not sure he necessarily fits the way that the Warriors want to play, but it would be a different look than what CP3 would give you with his more methodical style of play. What I mean by Fultz are just like the lack of three-point shooting and some of the second unit stuff. If you've got a TJD or a Looney out there, I'm not sure how that necessarily fits, although the pick and roll kind of stuff with Fultz and TJD might be interesting. He obviously doesn't have any playoff experience, basically, so I don't know how that would work out there. Yeah, it's an interesting thought, I think, from the Warriors standpoint. If you just said 2-for-2 swap Paul and Moody for Isaac and Fultz, I wouldn't do it just because you cannot trust the body of either. If you're guaranteed that Isaac was going to be fully healthy across the next, the rest of his contract, which he's got another $17.4 million deal for next season. If you could guarantee that, then I might think about it, just because he is such a difference-making player on defense. But with the injury history of both players, I just wouldn't do that. However, if I'm the Warriors, I'd be pushing heavily for that second player. If I was definitely getting Isaac, I'd push for the second player to be Wendell Carter Jr., who the franchise reportedly had interest in going back to the 2020 draft. With obviously, they ended up taking James Wiseman, but there was a report at the time that the Warriors were interested in dealing the second overall pick to the Chicago Bulls for Carter and the fourth pick, which in hindsight would have been a good deal. There were reports kind of a few weeks ago that Carter was potentially on the table. He's had some injury issues himself over the last couple of seasons, and that seems to have gone away now. I think Orlando seemed to be pretty keen on keeping him. But again, if they were desperate for a veteran point guard and, had some high hopes for a young talent like Moody, then I think the Warriors would definitely try and push for Carter, who I think would be a great fit in the Warriors system. More of an offensive-minded player than a defensive-minded player, but a great rebounder. A guy that does give you that size at 6'10", 6'11", and he's also a three-point shooting threat. I think he's shooting 40% from range on the season, and I think that thought has always been an interesting one for the Warriors in terms of, can you find a 5-out spacing big man to play next to Draymond? Don't know what that would do with the starting lineup. I still think that Carter might come off the bench in that scenario and then still play 25 minutes or whatever else. But I think he would be a really good fit. And so if it was Isaac and Carter for Paul and Moody, I think that's a deal that the Warriors would certainly think about making. Maybe Orlando would need a bit more. You could chuck a lottery protected first round pick or a second round pick in there in that deal. I don't know if there's any Magic fans listening, then let me know. But it does sound like maybe their interest in a veteran point guard is a little bit overblown, and maybe that's not necessarily the case anymore before the deadline. Another one that I actually put out on Twitter, so this is a very similar kind of one, but it's actually a 3-teamer, a little bit more complicated. So the Warriors get Jonathan Isaac again, Dorian Finney-Smith, and Nick Claxton from the Nets. The Magic get Paul and Moody again, and the Nets get Fultz, Kevon Looney, a 2026 and 2028 first-round picks from the Warriors, and a 2029 second from the Warriors. So I'll lay that out in kind of team order. So the Warriors give up CP3, Moody, Looney, the 2026 and 2028 first and the 2029 second. Get back Jonathan Isaac, Dorian Finney-Smith, Nick Claxton. The Magic get CP3 and Moody for Isaac and Fultz, which is basically what I just laid out before. And Brooklyn get Fultz, Looney, 2026 and 2028 first and a 2029 second for Finney-Smith and Claxton. I've spoken to a few people about this. If there's some Nets fans, if there's some Magic fans, let me know what you think. But I've spoken to a few people, and they think it's kind of not far off the mark in terms of value for each team. That's something I think the Warriors would wrestle with, because you're giving up 2 first-round picks now. There might have to be some protections on those. I don't know how it would work. But I think you'd probably struggle to give up both your first-round picks for guys that aren't star-level players. Like, you're not Nick Claxton, Jonathan Isaac, Dorian Finney-Smith aren't making all-star teams anytime soon. And you bring in 3 players. Yes, you're taking out 3 players, but you bring in 3 players who are just, strengthening the depth of the rotation some more, which is not really what Steve Kerr wants to do, because he's had so many question marks about the rotation, given guys 3 through 10 are all kind of similar, and that would probably just remain the case with bringing in these 3 guys. So in saying that, it definitely improves your defense, and you get 3 really, really good defenders in there. And so it's going to be interesting to see how much the Warriors kind of want to address their defense, or whether they think, hey, we've just got Draymond back. We're hopefully going to get GP2 back after the All-Star break. That will kind of lift our defense to a level that we would like it, and that is good enough for us to hopefully get back in the playoff picture. But that kind of 3-team deal, Magic again, Paul and Moody for Isaac and Fultz, I think is pretty fair value for Orlando. And then Brooklyn, if they want to rebuild, that it sounds like they're happy to give up Finney-Smith. Claxton's an interesting one, because Brooklyn obviously love him. However, he's due a contract in the summer. He's only getting paid like $9 million, 9 point something, I think, this season, which is incredible value. And then by the sounds of it, he's going to want a deal probably upwards of $80 million in the offseason, which is probably another reason why the Warriors wouldn't necessarily do that, because they wouldn't necessarily want to commit long-term to another guy in Nick Claxton when you've already got to re-sign Clay, hopefully in the offseason, potentially a contract extension for JK as well, that could be upwards of $100 million. So that's just kind of committing more money. And I think if you were to give up 2 first-round picks in that deal, then I think you're kind of hand into having to pay Claxton in free agency, because then if you let him leave for nothing, what's the point of doing the deal right now? I mean, when you're 12th in the Western Conference, you don't really want to be bringing in rentals for 6 months, for not even 6 months, for 3 months. Like, you just don't want to be doing that. Looney's a bit of an interesting point, and the reason I raise him is because I thought it was notable that Slater, and his kind of Anthony Slater, that is, of The Athletic, on his trade deadline preview article last week, kind of mentioned that Looney could be used as like the salary filler in a trade. Obviously, he doesn't have too much value necessarily, but as a salary filler, he could be included, which is, again, notable because, you know, he's been a kind of pillar of the franchise over these last few years. Obviously had a really poor season. You know, going back to the start of the last season, you know, Steve mentioned him as the moral compass of the team. He has so much pull, I suppose, in the locker room with his veteran presence and leadership. So it would be a loss, obviously, to lose him. But given his form on the court this season, you know, it would be a cold-blooded move to make. But I think if you're getting an upgrade, which Claxton definitely would be, then I think it's worthwhile doing. You might have to pull the trigger there. Another one I've got here, a third one. Let's go for kind of a higher caliber player. So Wiggins, Moody, and a pick for Jeremy Grant. Now, I just think Grant's a better player than Wiggins at this stage, and I think that'd be worthwhile making the move, because it wouldn't upset your starting lineup. You would just simply bring, you know, start Grant obviously over Wiggins, and you'd have Steph, Clay, Grant, Wiggins, JK, and Draymond. And I just think you're upgrading that Wiggins spot. Maybe not as good a perimeter defender, probably maybe a better defender against the bigger forward types. So you might have an issue there. But again, I think it's a worthwhile move. You know, Grant's been really good this season on a fair deal, a fairly similar deal, obviously, to Wiggins over the next few years, obviously on a little bit more, but I don't think that's going to stand in the way of Joe Lacob kind of ticking off that deal. That's a move that I'd heavily consider making. Obviously, you're trading Wiggins at the bottom of his value, essentially, and maybe it sounds like on state just hope that they're going to get the Wiggins, you know, they're going to get a return of the Wiggins that we saw in, you know, 2021-22. You know, it was an all-star and second best player on a championship team. So we'll just wait and see. It sounds like Wiggins probably isn't going to get moved at this stage, though. But that is a deal that I would consider making for Jeremy Grant. But again, it sounds like Portland have no interest in giving up him either. Fourth one I've got here, again, a bit of a smaller deal. It was reported that the Warriors had kicked the tires on Alex Caruso over the last few days. GP2, Moody, and maybe a pick for Caruso and Torrey Craig is the deal. And so my thought with Caruso is that you're just not going to have him and GP2 on the same roster. There's too much overlap in their skill sets there. Caruso is a better player than GP2, don't get me wrong. And GP2's body over these last couple of seasons, he's just not playing. Like, it's as simple as that. And so as good as he is when he's on the floor, as good as he is defensively, you know, he's still a very limited offensive player. Caruso, a better offensive player, shooting 40% from three-point range this season, can handle the ball and play make for you a little bit. Again, an excellent perimeter defender. So Caruso would just be a major upgrade on GP2. I think Moody would probably hold more value than Torrey Craig does. And then if the Warriors need to throw in a second round or a lottery protected first to kind of, you know, fit the gap there between, you know, GP2 and Caruso with the upgrade, then so be it. I don't hate it. I think Caruso could be a hugely impactful player. Sounds like Chicago kind of wanting the world for him, which is fair enough. He's a very good role player. And that's, again, a deal that I would consider making. And just quickly on Moody, obviously back-to-back 21-point games before he got injured. There's a lot of fans out there that would just be shaking their head at what I'm proposing here with him in kind of every single deal. You obviously got to give up something to get something. And put simply, Steve has not wanted to play Moses consistently across his 3-year career to date. And I actually personally think like he deserves an opportunity elsewhere. He just, for the good of his career, for the good of his finances, moving forward, his ability to get another lofty contract past his rookie deal. He'll get a contract, obviously, but depending on what he does here over the next year and a half, that's obviously going to determine what kind of contract he gets. And we're talking about JK now as potentially $100 million player. His value on his next contract has raised maybe double, maybe $30 to $40 million over these last few weeks. And that's the kind of opportunity that Moses deserves to get, where he might go from a guy who gets 40 to 50 million to a guy that gets 70, 80 million on his next contract. And so I think he deserves that opportunity. And I've been very sympathetic to his situation and the inability for Steve to trust him and play him meaningful minutes across the last few seasons. But again, back on that deal, that's a move that I would certainly consider, just with how impactful Alex Caruso can be. And Torrey Craig's a nice two-way forward as well. Again, another strong defender. There's a kind of point about all these deals is that the defensive end of the floor is where Golden State need to improve. That is for sure. The last one here is not a hypothetical trade as such. I'd still hold interest in DeJounte Murray if you're the Warriors. If you can flip Chris Paul, Moody, and picks for Murray. Obviously, it makes it difficult because he's only on $18-point-something million this season, well off what CP3's on. I'd look, if the Warriors were happy to kind of commit to long-term money, which it sounds like they're not necessarily looking to do that, but if they were, then is there some deal of, Paul, Moody, first-round picks for Murray and Capella, or Murray and DeAndre Hunter? Again, fortifies your defense a little bit, particularly if you get Capella. I know he's overpaid, but he had a good game against the Warriors on Saturday. I think him, Jalen Johnson, and Onyeka Okongwu combined for 60 points, 44 rebounds, and 10 assists. Just unbelievable. Murray's a very good player. He's a very good player. Long been reported as the best player left on the trade market here over the next couple of days. Sounds like the Hawks are probably going to keep him after all the talk of otherwise. Sounds like he's probably going to stay with Atlanta. But I would still kick the tires on that if I'm the Warriors, because I think he's a massive upgrade on CP3 on probably both ends of the floor. He's not the defender he once was, but he still averages well over a steal a game. Better three-point shooter this season, better offensive player in general than CP3. So if you could get to DeJounte Murray for CP3, Moody, and picks, and then obviously whatever the salaries work out with Capella or DeAndre Hunter, whatever it is, I don't think Atlanta would say yes to that. They're still trying to go for it, I think, and still try and make the playoffs. They're pairing CP3 with Trae Young doesn't really work at all. So unless I suppose they could try and do a Warrior style thing where it's CP3 just runs the second unit and is a six man for them rather than a starter. I don't know. I just don't think that works. I don't think Atlanta say yes, but I think if there's a genuine possibility, I think the Warriors should at least inquire about it, because I'm still pretty high on DeJounte Murray and what he can do as a player and how he could fit at the Warriors as well, alongside Steph and Clay. And you'd still have Wiggs, you'd still have JK, you'd still have Draymond. I think that's like a really, really good top six, and you'd be incredibly disappointed not to make the playoffs in that scenario. Other than that, guys, we'll finish it up there. Warriors taking on the Nets again in a few hours here. Hopefully they can respond from that overtime loss. It's going to be interesting to see kind of how they go with the injuries that are kind of wearing on them at the moment, and these overtime games where you had the double overtime game against the Lakers less than a fortnight ago, another overtime game against the Hawks where Steph, Clay played big minutes, Draymond as well, who's been incredible since coming back. But I think that game against the Hawks was the first time where some of the pressure that he faces playing as a small ball five consistently, especially against big lineups like the Hawks, that, as I said, that kind of trio of Johnson, Capella, and Okongwu made things really difficult and used their size to advantage. And it was the first time that you kind of saw that, this small ball lineup is going to have some issues, particularly with Wiggs going out of the game. He's doubtful for this one against Brooklyn. He probably won't play, which will hurt because Brooklyn do have obviously some offensive weapons. Cam Thomas went for 41 the last time these two teams played back on December 12 or 16, I think it was. Steph went for 37 in that game. Warriors won by 4. So let's hope for a repeat of that. Other than that, guys, if you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel already, that would be greatly appreciated. You can follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. You can follow me at POK252. That's POK252 on Twitter. You can send me a message there or a post there. Leave a comment below on the YouTube video if you have any hypothetical deals that you'd like the Warriors to consider, or you think the Warriors should consider over the next few days here. Let me know if there's any players you think Golden State should target, what type of player Golden State could target. Anything to do with the Warriors, I'll be sure to give a read. So thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.